Right. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Rasha Christi Bunker. And we have a special event on this evening for you. We usually do our events on Thursday, but we have a very privileged this evening to have a really accomplished Christian scholar and somebody who I've had the privilege of knowing when I lived in the United States. I've had the privilege of working with Dr. Brown on a number of occasions and have fond memories of learning from him and doing events with him. I even was once asked to go and teach at his Bible college. I'm sure that was a bit of a gamble on his part, but we are just so privileged to have Dr. Brown as our guest speaker this evening. Dr. Brown, welcome to Rasha Christi, South Africa.
It's my joy. It's great to work with Rasha Christi in the United States, one of the most solid and fearless campus ministries in America. So great to connect in South Africa now.
Yes, and we're motivated to get in touch with you because of some questions specifically from our Rasha Christi students over arguably some of the most important parts of the scriptures. That being the prophetic nature of the Bible, specifically as it relates to the person of Jesus Christ. Of course, so much hangs on that, and just in terms of the uniqueness of the scriptures with respect to its supernatural dimension. It's what distinguishes the Bible from other religious texts. But we've got some specific questions we wanted to ask you, and some of the questions were a bit too technical for me, so I thought I'd give you a call and ask you to help us through that. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Brown is a biblical scholar, and he has a PhD in Semitic languages. And in fact, some of those books behind him there are probably some of that work that he studies and learns, and has written many, many books, too many to mention here. But the specific series I would highly recommend to everybody is this 4-volume series. I think it's 5 volumes now, if my memory serves me correct. I've only got the 4. I still have to get the 5th one, in which he deals with answering Jewish objections to Jesus in great detail. It's a thorough piece of work, and it's so critical to the church, I think, that Dr. Brown has put together this brilliant work, because so many of the critical questions that are leveled against the Christian faith with respect to the nature of Jesus, I have found in my experience, are often related to objections that have come from Jewish scholars and rabbis. In fact, many of the objections I see leveled at particular passages that are come, for example, from Muslims and even liberal and secular scholars are often just some kind of a version of the same questions that have come from some of the Jewish rabbis who object to Jesus being the Messiah as we understand him within Christianity. And so I'm just delighted we can have Dr. Brown here this evening to help us navigate some of these very important questions. Dr. Brown, to begin with, we're going to focus on Volume 3, which is focusing specifically on those questions in the refer to prophetic passages that refer to Jesus. And perhaps you can maybe just explain to us, just give us a little bit of an introduction to yourself and why these things mattered so much to you. And then perhaps unpack for us a game plan and a strategy for dealing with these passages, because sometimes some of them seem really clear and others not as clear as others. And it can sometimes be quite a shock to a Christian when you seem to see these things so confidently, and then the skeptic walks in and goes, well, that's not really what the text means. And that can really, impact a person's faith. So maybe a little bit about your testimony, because I think it's so important why you went out to do the things you're doing, and then stitch that into a response and a basic approach to some of these passages.
Yeah, sure. So I came to faith in 1971 as a heroin shooting, LSD using, long-haired hippie rock drummer, 16 years old. So raised in a Jewish home and with some level of Jewish identity, but obviously my family was not religious. So I was bar mitzvahed at 13. But that was more of a social event than a spiritual event. And with the whole rock culture of the day, I saw my first rock concert when I was 13, so Jimi Hendrix in concert. And I wanted to be like the rock stars, got caught up with the whole spirit of the age, rebellion and drugs and rock and roll. And then my 2 best friends got born again, and I went to a little gospel preaching church to pull them out. And over the course of months, the people there began to pray for me. The Holy Spirit began to deal with me. And by the end of 71, I was radically transformed, free from drugs. And when my dad saw the change in my life, he said, "Well, Michael, that's wonderful, but we're Jews. We don't believe in this. It's good you're off drugs, but you need to talk to the local rabbi." And he introduced me to the local rabbi. He and I became friends. We began to interact at length, and he would bring me to different rabbis to talk to. And I remember he brought me to a university professor and gave me a book that he had written. And in the book, he was debunking the messianic prophecies. And when I went to talk to my pastor had no answers for these things. In fact, my pastor was very deeply devoted in prayer, in the word. He had memorized many scriptures from King James Version, spent hours a day in prayer, but he had literally zero background in apologetics. And to be honest, in the early 70s, apologetics was not really as well known as it is today. I would say the average person in our church would not have known what the word meant. And then Jewish apologetics in particular were really lacking. There had been Messianic Jews who knew Jewish literature very well, who were good in apologetics before the Holocaust. But it seemed post-Holocaust, we were lacking that. And when I would go to Jews for Jesus and groups like that, asking them for help on the questions the rabbis were raising to me, they were great in evangelism. They had great outreach tracks, but they didn't have in-depth apologetic responses. And then when I would go to Christian scholars, as I began to go to college and try to find, it was secular school, but tried to find out about other Christian scholars, they were great scholars, but they were completely insensitive to the Jewish objections. So I was kind of thrown in the deep water and had to learn to swim in that regard on my own. And one of the things that will immediately come up is the messianic prophecies are challenged. Many other things will be challenged about our faith and our view of God's triunity or the deity of the Messiah or the ongoing relevance of the Torah. Those things will come up, but immediately the messianic prophecies will get attacked. So I remember, reading the quotation in Hebrews 1 that quotes from 2 Samuel 7, and I'll be a father to him and he'll be my son. So this is a prophecy about Jesus. And then the rabbi says to me, we'll read it in context. That's just God talking to David about David and his descendants. And if they sin, he'll deal with them. Are you saying Jesus sinned? And suddenly these proof texts seem to evaporate. Or Hosea, the 11th chapter, which is quoted in Matthew 2, out of Egypt, I called my son. But when you go back to Hosea 11, number one, it's not a prophecy. It's talking about history. And it's talking about Israel's ongoing disobedience as a nation. So how does that apply messianically? So these were real challenges. And as much as I knew the Lord had dramatically transformed my life, I also knew that I needed answers to these questions because we're to love God with our heart and our mind. And an experience is wonderful. To know that the Lord saved you and transformed you is foundational. But then you don't shut off your brain to follow him. So I was really challenged and I dug deep. That's why I ended up majoring in Hebrew in college and then getting a PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Literatures from New York University, because I felt it was essential that I could study these things on my own, look at the text firsthand, examine the dictionaries, the commentaries, and come to my own conclusions. And the interesting thing is the more I dug, the more I studied, the more my intellectual faith was strengthened. My spiritual faith, you could say, was always strong, but the intellectual part of my faith got strengthened along the way. So a major strategy for understanding messianic prophecy is to start with something that Jews and Christians agree on, namely that David is a prototype. David is the prototype of the Messiah in many ways, to the point that, for example, Ezekiel 34 refers to the Messiah as David. So David becomes it is the son of David who is the Messiah, and David is the forerunner of the Messiah. And David was a priestly king. On the one hand, he's from the tribe of Judah, and he is the one that establishes this new line. There were promises that God gave to Judah in Genesis 49 that the rulership would belong to Judah and the gathering of the nations would come to Judah. All right. And then David is the chosen one from the tribe of Judah, and there'll be a dynasty in his name, a lasting dynasty. But David also performed priestly functions. For example, he offers up sacrifices at the end of 2 Samuel, the 24th chapter, which is something only priests could do. He wore the ephod in 2 Samuel 6 in bringing back the ark. And then most significantly, in Psalm 110, it says to the Messiah / David, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So yes. David, the king, also functions as a priest. He's a priestly king. And then in the book of Zechariah, the 6th chapter, Zechariah is told to take Joshua, the high priest. Now, Joshua is normally called by a different name. Yehoshua, the high priest, is normally called Yeshua, Jesus, actually. Just a little side note there. In the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, he's known as Yeshua. But Yehoshua, Yeshua, is seated on a throne, and a crown is put on his head. And he is to symbolize the branch. And the branch, we know from Zechariah 3, from Jeremiah 23, and rabbinic commentaries recognize this as well. The branch is another name of the Messiah. So Joshua sits as a priest on a throne wearing a crown, a royal priest, as a sign of the branch, the Messiah. So why do I make such a big deal about David being a priestly king, or Joshua, a priest, being a forerunner of the Messiah sitting on his throne? It's because the Messiah has those dual functions. The Messiah functions as a king, and the Messiah functions as a priest. And as a priest, he deals with sin. As a priest, he is our intercessor. As a priest, he makes atonement for us and takes our place. You see, many Christians will say when you read the Old Testament, you'll find two streams of prophecy. You'll find the royal stream, the reigning stream, and then the suffering stream. Well, that's true. But the question is, why is the suffering stream messianic? Based on what? It is based on the Messiah's priestly role. And traditional Judaism has, by and large, lost sight of the priestly role of the Messiah, looking to him to be a reigning king, looking to be a great rabbi and teacher, but forgetting that he must first deal with sin. So that's the first large point we make. Then we indicate through prophetic scriptures that the Messiah had to begin his mission before the second temple was destroyed, which takes place in the year 70 AD. And then based on that, we look for potential candidates. The other thing is that we learn to understand.
Sorry, just to interrupt you there, because what I wasn't aware of, and you mentioned it in page 14 of your book, is that belief in Messiah by the Jews was a fundamental commitment. I didn't realize that there was that demand placed on that. And you talk about this in terms of, I'll read it to you now. It says, he claims that the belief in the coming of the Messiah is more central to Judaism than even the observance of Sabbath or Yom Kippur, even referring to the belief in the coming of the Messiah as the cardinal principle of the Jewish faith. I wasn't aware of how deep that commitment to messianic belief was within the Jewish tradition, going back to the period of Jesus.
Yeah, well, at the time of Jesus, we can debate how widespread the messianic faith was. In other words, we know that there was different speculation about the Messiah and who he would be. It became a more passionate part of Judaism over the centuries in the midst of exile, no temple, no royal throne. So by the time of Maimonides in the 12th century, when he formulates the 13 principles of faith for Judaism, so one is in God's absolute unity and his spiritual existence, the role of the Torah, the future resurrection of the dead, just fundamentals. A traditional Jew every day recites Ani Ma'amin be'emunah shlema b'viat HaMashiach. I believe in perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah. So even though for Judaism, Torah is what's central, observing Torah, studying Torah, obeying God through Torah, belief in the coming of the Messiah has become tremendously important in Judaism. Again, a traditional Jew would say we can have Judaism without the Messiah because we still have God, Torah, etc. and Christians can't have Christianity without Christ. And I said, well, if we need to be saved, we need a savior. That's not a problem to me. But at the same time, traditional Judaism can't exist without traditions. Rabbinic Judaism can't exist without the rabbis. And yet, it is an essential belief in the coming of the Messiah, who will ultimately be a final redeemer and who will turn the Jewish people back to God. So this is very important in Jewish tradition, but that same tradition has largely lost sight of the Messiah's priestly role. The other thing that we need to do is rightly understand how prophecy works. In a lot of our popular apologetics, we like to use mathematical statistics and say, well, Jesus fulfilled 300 messianic prophecies, and the possibility of doing that is it would be equivalent to stacking coins, 5 feet high across the state of Texas, which is a giant state, and just marking one of them, and on the first pick, you pull them out. The problem I have with that is that it turns prophecy into something mathematical, instead of understanding the various ways that prophecy was understood and the ways that New Testament writers, as first century Jews, interpreted it. For example, I mentioned Hosea 11:1, which is quoted in Matthew 2:15. So when Jesus comes out of Egypt, this is to fulfill what is written in Hosea, out of Egypt I called my son. So the rabbis will say, look, just look it up. It's not a prophecy. It's talking about Israel in Egypt. And it's saying when Israel was a child, that I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son, but the more I called, the more he rebelled. You say, exactly. Matthew's point is, as it happened to Israel, God's firstborn son in its infancy, so also it happens to the Messiah, God's firstborn son in his infancy. And the same way, the slaughter of the baby boys parallels the attempt to slaughter Moses. As it happened to Moses, it happened to the Messiah. The quotation from Psalm 41, which is in the midst of a psalm of sickness and confession of sin and prayer for healing, the psalmist says, the one who ate with me has lifted up his heel against me, has betrayed me. And Jesus quotes that. Well, what does that mean? Because the context talks about sin and sickness. All that it means is, as it happened to David, so it happened to the Messiah. In other words, the authors of the New Testament are seeing these parallels and these foreshadowings, and the whole of the book pointing towards the coming of the Messiah. And then when he comes and works miracles among them for 3 years, then predicts his death, then rises from the dead, because you don't have this without the resurrection from the dead. And then he opens their minds so they can understand it. There it is. And not just the overt and clear prophecies like Isaiah 53 about the Messiah dying for our sins and us rejecting him and misunderstanding his mission. Not just that, but you have the whole of the history of Israel and the people of God pointing towards the Messiah. Hence these parallels. I'll give you one other. Hebrews 10 quotes from Psalm 40, and that it says, when the Messiah comes into the world, he says, it's written about me in the volume of the book. I come to do your will. So Hebrews 10 quotes from the Septuagint, the Jewish translation that the readers would have had access to. And there's the immediate objection, wait a second. In that very psalm, as you read on, the psalmist confesses his sin. So how could that be? Are you saying Jesus sinned? No. You've got to understand the psalm. The psalmist comes to the revelation that as he's reading the scroll of the Torah, B'Megillat Sefer Katuv Alai, in the volume of the book, it's written about me, he realizes, God, you don't really want sacrifices and offerings. You want me. The sacrifices and the offerings are a picture of my life given over in complete obedience to you. I get it. I see it. That's what you want. I come to do your will. Problem is, I still fall short and I sin. Hebrews is saying this is ultimately about the one who lives this out. In other words, the sacrifices and the offerings are ultimately pointing to a life given completely over to God. It's the Messiah. So rather than these being like butchered quotes or things taken out of context, rather the psalmist or the gospel writer or Paul, they are seeing a deeper significance. They are looking at a bigger picture, And then in keeping with Jewish interpretation of the day, they're citing these texts. We look at all of them as mathematical proof texts and so on. It's a wrong way of approaching it. It's not the organic way that it would have been read or understood. Here, one more example. Psalm 2, we're very familiar with. You're my son, this day I've begotten you. And we say, well, obviously, a prophecy about Jesus, the Messiah. Psalm 2, the nations of the world want to cast off his yoke and the yoke of the Lord. God's going to give him a rod of iron to rule and reign. Absolutely true. It is certainly a messianic prophecy. But how did it originate? What's its original context? Some of the rabbis said it's a prophecy about David and about the Messiah. I understand that this was a coronation psalm. So it was originally spoken perhaps over David or Solomon. They did rule over the surrounding nations. There was a mini Israelite empire, and it is a psalm of coronation spoken. And remember, when the Davidic monarch would be installed as king, the son of David would be installed as king, God would say to him, "You are my son," right? Because that's what he had promised. Whoever's the king will be my son. So here, when, let's say, Solomon is installed as king, they would recite this psalm over him. And the rulers, want to revolt against the Lord and his anointed one, but God's established his son in Jerusalem, etc. But it never reaches its fulfillment. It's not over all the nations, which God says, ask of the nations and I'll give them. Well, now with each new generation, each new Davidic king is installed and you recite the psalm over him, but it's becoming meaningless. The guy's beaten down. The guy is under the bondage to Pharaoh or to Babylon. And then ultimately, there's no king. There's no throne. The people are in exile. When they're restored to their land, they have no authority. They're under the Greeks. They're under the Romans. And now what's the meaning of the psalm now? Now the fullness of the meaning becomes clear, that no earthly king this was never fulfilled in our history. It was spoken, it was recited, but it was never fulfilled. Where is that king? And then you begin to realize it's a more exalted king. It's not just a regular earthly king. It's a more exalted king. It's one coming in the clouds of heaven. So this way through Israelite history, God prepares the people for the coming of the Messiah. So some of the messianic prophecies were literally given as promises to David or his descendants, but they never reached fulfillment. And now the New Testament authors see these passages as still crying for fulfillment. They had a historical context that never reached its goal, but they were true prophecies that must come to pass. So if they didn't come to pass with David or Solomon or Hezekiah or Josiah, who will they come to pass with? The Messiah, the supernatural Messiah. And this is how God developed the hope in the midst of the people. So there is a historical context, but the gospel writers or New Testament writers are not ripping the verses out of their context. They're rather saying, as we look at the context, we see they never reach their fulfillment. They find their fulfillment in the Messiah.
Yeah. So it seems to me then you've got, number one, the issue of fulfillment, and then also making a distinctions between those prophecies which are much more explicit in terms of Jesus born in Bethlehem, or something that's very precise and like a proof text like Isaiah 53, for example. And then others are parallelisms and potential foreshadowings. And so when we do these things, we need to bear that in mind, that there's a variety, a kind of a spectrum of these things related to prophetic literature when we're considering some of these passages. Would that be fair to say that that's a good way to approach the text?
Yes, exactly. You have some that are explicit prophecies. You have some that are types, foreshadowings, parallels, some that have an ongoing significance of fulfillment. For example, if you look at Ezekiel 36, it prophesies the return of the Jews from Babylonian exile. Isaiah speaks about it beginning in chapter 40 of the book of Isaiah. Jeremiah speaks of it in numerous passages. But what was prophesied didn't fully happen. The prophecy was a glorious return and God changing the hearts of the nation, and God's work among the people being so extraordinary, the nations of the world would come to worship the God of Israel. But that's not what happened. They did return, they did rebuild the temple, but it was a fraction of what was expected. The glory was not fully what was expected. What happened? Well, it partly came to pass, and the rest is yet to come. There are many prophecies like that. It's a larger hermeneutical principle that if God promises 1 through 10 will happen, and 1 through 5 happen on schedule, and the rest doesn't mean it's a false prophecy. It means 6 through 10 is still to come. So the whole idea of a second coming is not a cop-out. It's in keeping with patterns of Old Testament prophecy. You get the beginning fulfillment, and then the rest comes later.
Yeah, and that would be consistent with some of the stuff in the New Testament in terms of, for example, Christ's victory over Satan, that we have victory now in some sense, but there's going to be a completion of that victory in the future as well then. So that's similar
already,
as well.
Yes, or already not yet, realized eschatology. Exactly, those same concepts.
You've stirred up a hornet's nest, yeah, because I'll tell you what, the questions are rolling in here like crazy. So I guess we're going to have to start diving in here. Let me just grab that first question we got from the students. I want to read it to you. This is the debate about prophecy fulfillment. Yeah, this is the part of the conversation with the students. I'll just read it to you. Among Christian believers, opinions vary as to which Old Testament passages are messianic prophecies and which are not, and whether the prophecies that claim to have been fulfilled are intended to be prophecies. The authors of these Old Testament prophecies often appear to be describing events that had already occurred. For example, the New Testament is talking in Matthew 2:14. And this is the out of Egypt, which we've discussed at some extent. So that was the question for a very interesting discussion on this. And then further on, it says, according to modern scholarship, the suffering servant described in Isaiah 53 is actually the Jewish people. According to some, the rabbinic response by Rashi and Maimonides is that although the suffering servant passage clearly is prophetic, and even if Psalm 22 is prophetic, the Messiah has not yet come. Therefore, the passage cannot possibly be talking about Jesus as noted above. There is some controversy about the phrase, they have pierced my hands and feet. So that was the specific question then. Perhaps maybe, Dr. Brown, you could maybe respond specifically to that question to begin with as we move into our Q&A session for us.
Yeah, so that last one really has about 3 or 4 different parts to it. The idea that it couldn't refer to the Messiah because the Messiah hasn't yet come is just circular reasoning. So we dismiss that. That's proving what you want to, assuming what you want to prove. But let's look at the other issues. Does modern scholarship agree on the identity of the servant in Isaiah 53? Oh no, quite the contrary. Modern scholarship remains massively divided. There are numerous candidates, and even within rabbinic literature, their ideas, Saadia Gaon, in the 10th century suggested it was speaking of Jeremiah. And there are Isaiah 52, 13 to 15, which speaks of the servant's exaltation after suffering. That is widely applied to Messiah, son of Joseph, in rabbinic literature. In fact, so widely that a 15th century preacher said that's the only way we understand it. Then you have within the Talmud different references. One time Isaiah 53 applied to Moses, one time applied to the Messiah, one time applied to righteous remnant in other rabbinic literature. We know from the days of Origen that there was a Jewish interpretation in this book, Contra Celsum. He mentions talking to Jews who applied it to the suffering of Israel. And the so-called Big Three, the main medieval commentaries, Rashi, Radak, and Ibn Ezra, all apply it to either Israel as a nation or the righteous remnant. But if you'll get commentaries on Isaiah or just books that deal with the suffering servant, you'll see that there remains massive discussion and debate as to who it's speaking of. But here's why it can't refer to the nation as a whole. The servant of the chapter is righteous. The servant is suffering for the sins of others. And yet, we know, according to the blessings and the curses, Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, that if Israel is righteous, Israel will be the head, not the tail. If Israel is righteous, Israel will be the lead nation. If Israel is in exile and the temple is destroyed, which we see through the prophetic books, it's because of Israel's sin and disobedience. So if Israel is in exile suffering, it's because of sin and disobedience, not because of righteousness. You say, well, no, it's the righteous remnant within Israel. The problem with that is, according to this passage, the rabbinic way of understanding it is the nations of the world are confessing that the righteous remnant suffered. We thought Israel was suffering for its sins, but it was suffering for our sins. But what does it say? And at the cost of its wounds, is healing for us. Well, hang on. According to the prophets, when the nations mistreated the Jewish people, God would smite them and God would judge them. God would not heal them. He would judge them and smite them. But this says that through the servant's suffering, healing comes to us. So that can't be the confession of the Gentile kings about the righteous remnant, and it can't be a description of Israel as a whole. It has to be speaking of one individual who suffers on behalf of the nation. When we go back to Isaiah 49, we see the servant of the Lord as an individual. He's called Israel because he represents the nation, but he has a mission to Israel to regather the exiles and bring Israel back to God. And he confesses, it seems as if he failed. It seems as if he wasted his strength because he's rejected by his people. But God says, not only will you restore Israel, but you'll also be a light to the nations. And then chapter 50, it speaks of the same servant who is beaten. The hairs of his beard are pulled out. So he is a rejected, suffering servant, and he's even rejected by his own people. So Isaiah's already told us who he is. He's this individual, this righteous individual, rejected by his own people, actually killed, but then he goes on living. So you ask, well, who could that possibly be referring to? So it doesn't work for the nation as a whole. It doesn't work for the righteous remnant. It only works for the Messiah. As to Psalm 22, they pierced my hands and my feet. Let's remember that Psalm 22 is quoted in the New Testament, but that specific verse is not quoted. They pierced my hands and feet. That phrase is not. But the passage as a whole is quoted. But Psalm 22 is not a prophecy. Psalm 22 is about a righteous sufferer who is delivered from the jaws of death, and his deliverance is so great it brings praise to God to the ends of the earth. And the description is such that it seems to uncannily describe crucifixion. All of he's fully exposed, his bones are out of joint, he's surrounded and mocked. And we have no example in the life of David or anyone else in Israel's history that went through that exact experience. So it is a poetic psalm about a righteous sufferer delivered from the jaws of death with this worldwide implication. And again, who fulfills it? See, it was there, it was recited, it was used, but who brings it to its full meaning? Only the Messiah. Now, what about Karu Yadav Raglai, Kari Yadav Raglai, like a lion there at my hands and my feet? The vast majority of Masoretic manuscripts, the Hebrew manuscripts, read like a lion, my hands and my feet. There's no verb there. So Rashi, again, Rashi lives 1040, 1105. Rashi says like a lion, they are mauling my hands and my feet. Because they're not licking, they're mauling. So they're tearing up. However, the earliest attestation that we have is Psalm 22 from Nachal Hever in Qumran, so 1st, 2nd century. It says not Ka'ari, but Karu, which would be something like they dug through, they bore through. The Septuagint, which is the oldest Jewish translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, also says they pierced or they bore through. And then there are about a dozen Masoretic manuscripts that read Ka'aru or Karu. So from medieval times, this is entirely a Jewish textual discussion. And you can make a good case for they pierced my hands and my feet. So Psalm 22, the Psalm of the righteous sufferer, delivered from the jaws of death with a description of what uncannily looks like crucifixion. The deliverance is so great that it brings praise to God to the ends of the earth. So the simple question, who fulfills that? And again, only one possible candidate.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Those are very important passages, Psalm 22. And look, Dr. Brown's book is written like, I highly encourage for you, those students here at Northwest University, come to my house and come and read Dr. Brown's books together with me. We'll drink tea and we'll study this awesome stuff he's done for us here. He's done all the heavy lifting for us, and thank you so much for that. All right, some more questions here. This one is, hello, Dr. Brown. In 1 Corinthians 15, verse 4, it is stated that Jesus was buried and rose on the third day according to the scriptures. To which Old Testament text is Paul referring here?
Yeah, so he's not referring to one verse. He's referring to a pattern of scriptures, according to the scriptures, plural. He's not just quoting a single verse, as he often does in his writings. You know, he's absolutely fluent in the Hebrew Bible and quoting it left and right from memory with incredible insight. So, and at times deviating from the Septuagint if he's not happy with the way the Septuagint renders things. So what's he talking about? There are a bunch of passages that speak of the significance of the third day, and even the third day tying in with a resurrection theme. So he's looking for a theme here. And the whole thing is prophesied, Messiah's death and his resurrection. So, for example, God dealing with Israel, with sinning Israel in Hosea 6, he will smite them, but on the third day he will raise them up. Or Abraham in Genesis, the 22nd chapter, when he and Isaac are going to go to Mount Moriah. Remember, Isaac typifying, again, the giving up of your only son out of love and devotion to God. What does he say? That Isaac and I, the youth and I, will go to the mountain, and on the third day we will come back. So, and remember, Hebrews tells us that Abraham was ready to sacrifice Isaac, believing God would raise him from the dead. So here, the third day, the day of coming back, Hosea 6, on the third day, he'll raise us up. And then you have Jonah in the belly of the whale, 3 days and 3 nights, and then is cast out on the dry land. So his resurrection from death, from Sheol. And notice in Jonah 2, it's described that he's basically in Sheol. He's in the place of the dead, that's on the third day. And then you have just other times when that's the significant moment, God telling the children of Israel on the third day, be ready at Mount Sinai, or things like that through their history. So it's a day of great significance, but it's a day of resurrection. If there's a time when God's going to raise his son from the dead, the pattern would be the third day, according to the scriptures. That's all it's saying. Yeah. He doesn't quote a specific verse. When a specific verse is quoted, then you look for it, you look at the larger context, you understand it. But when it's something like this, you look for the larger pattern.
Okay, excellent. And then we've actually got a question, coming from America. So some Americans seem to be listening in as well. This is Mike Willenborg, our good friend, from SES. Mike's doing his PhD at Baylor University in philosophy. He says, hello, Dr. Brown. Thanks for being here. One question I have is, do contemporary Jews think they have some means by which to verify that the Messiah, whenever he comes, has a proper lineage?
The proper lineage, go ahead.
Then Mike says, if not, then what do they think the point of the relevant prophecies regarding the messianic lineage is supposed to be?
Yeah, so there'd be a twofold answer to that. Traditional Jews would put a lot of emphasis on their tradition, that our family tradition says we go back to this one or that one. So that would be one thing, that they would make a claim that by tradition they know things. So it would not be verifiable, but within their own circles, which puts such emphasis on tradition, they would make that claim. That's one thing. The other thing is that according to Maimonides, as he codified things in the 12th century, lived 1135 to 1204, according to Maimonides, that the Messiah would be recognized by the things that he did. So, for example, let's say he's leading the nation of Israel into obedience to the Torah. Okay, could he? I wonder, could he be the Messiah? And then he succeeds in rebuilding the temple. Whoa, this really looks like he could be the Messiah. And then he regathers the exiles, and then he fights the wars of the Lord. Then he's definitely the Messiah. So the reasoning would basically be that whoever does that by those things proves that he's the Davidic Messiah. In other words, the only possible way all those things could happen was if God was backing him as the Messiah, and therefore that would prove that he was of the line of David. But then you would doubtless have traditional Jews claiming that they had a tradition that his family line goes all the way back to David.
Yes. And so there, I think, if my memory serves me correct, it's so important what you said at the beginning of this talk, that the kingship role of authority takes precedent over the priestly function, which is also part of the Messiah's role there, because there it's the establishment of the temple and those things. And so,
right, but the Messiah, in traditional Judaism, as I mentioned, the priestly role of the Messiah is almost completely forgotten. So what you have instead is the Messiah will be a warrior. The Messiah will be a great teacher, kind of a glorified rabbi. He'll rebuild the temple, but he won't perform priestly functions in the temple. Rather, he will rebuild it as the Messiah. Some traditions, the temple will come down from heaven, but his priestly role, his role of making atonement, is basically forgotten. Now, there are Jewish traditions going back to the days of the Talmud and maybe earlier that speak of a second Messiah, Mashiach ben Yosef, Messiah son of Joseph, and he fights the wars of the Lord, but then he suffers and dies. There are a few commentaries that point to him having an atoning role with his death. But otherwise, Judaism does not see him as having an atoning role. Rather, for whatever reason, they developed an understanding that the Messiah would also have to suffer. So therefore, he suffers, and then Messiah, son of David, raises him from the dead and establishes the Messianic kingdom on the earth. But it's interesting that Jewish tradition has developed a picture of a suffering Messiah as well.
Yes. What's interesting to me, though, is just the instances where you have messianic expectation in the New Testament. For example, when Jesus is asks about who do people think the Son of Man is, and then he starts speaking about the Son of Man being raised up again, and then Peter pulls Jesus aside and says, "Look, no, that's not what we want to hear," and then Jesus rebukes him.
Right.
And that really there, to some extent, is dealing with the atonement role of the priest as well. So would you say then that was also prevalent in the minds of the Jesus' disciples, the kind of view that they saw Messiah more as a king, authoritarian kind of rule rather than a priestly role, a mediator at that level?
For sure. We do know that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are different messianic figures. There's Mashiach, Aharon, and David, the messiahs of Aaron and David. And then in what's called the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, which reaches its final form after the time of Jesus, but has origins before that it speaks of a Messiah from the line of Aaron and the tribe of Levi, and a Messiah from the tribe of Judah and the line of David. So there is that recognition of a priestly Messiah, but it was not as prevalent as the view of a royal Messiah, or let's just say more commonly held that the Messiah would be the deliverer. If you are the Messiah, then you're going to be the deliverer. You're going to be the one that sets us free from the tyranny of Rome and regathers the exiles. So there was very little vision, if any, of a Messiah who would die, let alone a crucified Messiah. And you have to understand, though, in the wisdom of God, these truths were not fully revealed in advance, because if you have it all in advance, you try to stage it, you try to make it happen, you try to figure it out in ways that would be counterproductive. Here, God had to veil it from their eyes, and then once it happens, you go look, and there it is. Well, once you go back and look, once you see it, as you say, you can't unsee it. And that's why so many Christians wonder how come the rabbis don't see it, because to the believer, it's so clear. But again, you can see how it's veiled first, and then after it happens, it's as clear as day. It's laid out verbatim.
Excellent. Another question here is, much of Isaiah 53 seems to use the past tense. On what basis can we be sure that the passage is meant to be predictive prophecy rather than a poetic description?
First thing,
or something that has occurred. For example, I have a vague memory that someone in the Talmud somewhere proposed that the passage could refer to Moses. I think we dealt with that to some extent earlier on.
Right. Yeah. So, if it referred to Moses, then the question is, who are the speakers and how does it apply in Isaiah's day, and why is it even being referenced there? But number one, there is something that even the rabbis recognize as prophetic perfect, which is describing future events as if they already happened. So the prophet sees it as if it already happened. If folks check rabbinic commentary to Numbers 24, I see him, but not yet. A scepter will rise from Judah. Well, the Hebrew doesn't say will rise, it has risen. So this is universally understood, that the prophet sees it in advance and prophesies it as if it already happened. I saw this president raised up and he did this and this, and I'm talking about something 300 years down the line. So prophetic perfect is commonly understood. Isaiah 9:6 and 9:5 in the Hebrew, that much of rabbinic literature understands to be messianic. What's that? A child is born to us, a son is, in Hebrew it's all past. Child has been born, son has been given. So there are two ways to understand that. One is that when the king was born, these words were spoken over him as if he was the one, but he wasn't. Or it's prophetic perfect. You speak it out in advance as if it already happened, because you see it as it's already unfolding and happening. When it comes to Isaiah 53, we ask the question, has it been fulfilled? Who could it have been referring to? Let's say it was referring to the prophet himself in his day, that he was rejected by his people, and yet some sense of how his death would be redemptive. Well, whatever happened, it wasn't fulfilled in him. No one brought that to pass. So even if you had a precursor, a forerunner of whom it was spoken, it doesn't find its fulfillment until the Messiah comes. So the simple question is, okay, if that happened already, then who did it happen to? Even traditional Jewish interpretation that interprets it with regard to the people of Israel sees it as future, because Israel's not yet been exalted. Israel has not yet been raised up for the nations to say, oh my, we thought Israel was suffering for its sins. We didn't realize Israel was suffering for our sins. So even traditional Judaism, trying to rebut our interpretation, sees the application as ultimately future. But my simple question is, did it happen yet? If it didn't happen through the Messiah, then who is this fulfilled through before him? And there's no candidate that works. Hence, people try to guess. The reason there are so many different interpretations of the passage is once you say it's not the Messiah, then there's an endless guessing, because nothing works. Nothing actually works. Yes. So you have to keep coming up with other candidates. Once you lock in on him, so many Jewish people have come to faith reading Isaiah 53. Or once they came to faith, that was the passage that solidified things. And many of us have had the same experience. Had it with my own dear dad. When challenged about what we believed, barely even knew the Bible then, open to Isaiah 53 and show it to them, and they're shocked, angry, shocked. One of my friends, his father got really mad. He said, I don't want to see the New Testament. I want to see our Bible. I said, Dad, this is the Bible the rabbi gave me when I was bar mitzvah. He goes, no, somebody changed it. That's how clear it is.
Yes, wonderful. Yes. And I know we're chewing through our time here now. I've got another question for you. Does Joel 2 prophecy a greater outpouring of the Spirit than we see in Acts 2, or is Acts 2 the final fulfillment of the prophecy of Joel 2?
Acts 2 is the beginning of the fulfillment, because Peter, in Acts the 2nd chapter, quoting from the end of Joel 2, or in Hebrew versions, the beginning of Joel 3, he says that in the last days, he adds those words. The Hebrew just says, "Va'achrei chen eshpochet ruchi," and after this, I'll pour out my Spirit. But Peter adds the words, they're not found in the Septuagint or other ancient translations. In the last days, God says, I'll pour out my Spirit. And we know from the consistent language of the New Testament that the last days is from the death and resurrection of Jesus until the end of the age. And Acts 2:39, the promise is to you and to your children and to all who are far off, as many as the Lord our God will call. So this is it is the beginning, and it will continue the outpouring until the end of the age.
Okay, excellent. I think we've got time for one more question here now. Suppose someone says that Daniel 9:24-27 refers to events that occur prior to the destruction of a third as yet future temple. How would you respond to this suggestion?
Well, the problem with that, there is some debate about the 70th week of Daniel, and is that prophesying something still future? But the whole context of Daniel 9, Daniel mourning in repentance in Babylon, sees the words of the prophet Jeremiah that the exile would last for 70 years. Even though the people have only been in exile 50-something years, he's been in exile close to 70 years with a small remnant. So he begins to petition God about the 70 years being fulfilled. And God sends Gabriel with a revelation, not about 70 years, but about 77s of years, so a period of 490 years, during which the second temple will be rebuilt and destroyed. So the whole context is what will happen during that time period. And during that period, atonement has to be made. Righteousness has to be brought in. Various things have to take place before that second temple is destroyed. So some have argued that some of the prophecy had to be before the second temple was destroyed, and there's a final link of it that will happen when the Messiah returns, or that the 70th week is postponed. I don't see it like that. I would not object to kind of a repeat of the 70th week at the end of the age, just as many would see Matthew 24 referring to the destruction of the temple in the year 70, and then also referring to the end of the age. I'm open to that possibility, but clearly the whole thrust of the passage is that the these things are going to happen. The temple will be rebuilt, and then the temple will be destroyed. And these things will happen before the destruction of the second temple. So to me, it's a very, very important question. And by the way, I know we had limited time with me about to do my live radio show, but Simon, I love the work you're doing, and I have the utmost respect for Ratio Christi. So if we need to do a part 2 and just devote it more to questions or something like that, I'm in. We'll find the time to do it with joy.
That will be an absolute privilege, Dr. Brown. Wow, that is such a treat for us to have you here. Absolutely, we'd love to. I'll chat to Dylan and see if we can set up another session. But let me go further than that and say to him, when this COVID thing finally clears, we've been itching to get you out here to South Africa. I would love to have you tour and speak all over the country and encourage the church in Africa and the believers here. I think that you've got so much to offer and to share, and not just in terms of your knowledge of the scriptures, but also just in terms of encouraging the saints. And so maybe if we can work that out in the future, that would be wonderful, because I think that you're very gifted in being able to speak to people on a lay level, but you can also do the academic work if you have to. And I think in our age nowadays, we need Christians who can also deal with the heavier issues. So that's very important as well, to respond to the critics and the skeptics out there.
Yeah, well, it will be a joy. But my ministry philosophy: avoid controversy at all costs. So but anyway,
yes.
We'll dive in. We'll take the things on if we could do some debates, campus debates.
Absolutely.
Tackle
And I just commend everybody who's listening to Dr. Brown. Ask Dr. Brown's website. There's just so much resources over there, and just brilliant sermons that you can listen to of his and teaching. I encourage all of those listening this evening to go and look at Dr. Brown's stuff. And if you can get your hands on some of his work, it's just tremendous. It's good food for your soul. And so as we wrap up this evening, I just want to thank the speakers. Let the audience know that on this Thursday, we will be doing another talk with Keith Matthey, a local South African legal guy, who's going to be talking to us about decolonizing Jesus. And we're going to talk about that important issue. But thanks, Dr. Brown, and God bless you. Are we gone?